Somebody want to start by refreshing my memory from Friday?
And I didn't see the video, so I'll be grateful for a refresh.
I haven't been paying really good attention.
We didn't do
So
the
Steven,
it's on
you're
you.
just it.
and we didn't do the concluding notes at the end either.
No, he didn't.
Well, I don't know whether that's why we concluded, but I know that we didn't agree on.
Yeah, you assigned us homework, Steven. What did you assign us?
Well, the homework was to try to uncover the disagreement there better. Like, what are the use cases of a base layer? Is it purely an architectural thing or not? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and you had a question.
I mean, I do remember like the last point of contention.
Yeah, whether
Curious
the
if you
base
had
layer
any more
even
thoughts
needs a
on it.
front end, right? I think, which
Well,
also
yeah.
shows some disagreement. Because for me,
Two things there. One is the base layer, does it include a base front end? And two, like, is it, should it have the kind of belief scoring mechanism?
true.
Because it starts to sound more and more to me like it's just base layers defined as Socrates, which doesn't match what I would understand as the base layer's purpose.
Yeah, so but maybe we can sidestep the scoring thing, because that of course fully depends on what you define as a base layer. So we can focus on more on what is the use of a base layer, which I think is a more fundamental disagreement. And yeah, that I think the way to resolve that is by focusing on use cases, because you defined, Timothy, the base layer as the common subset we can all agree on that needs to be supported. I remember, and yeah, I don't agree with that. For me, what I've been calling a base layer really is a system that supports use cases that have a value outside of the other things that we actually also can agree on, and that I agree on. But I see them as they need to be supported distinctly, because they're separate use cases, and people that want to use one set of the use cases might not be interested in the other set of use cases, even though we as a group can agree on both sets of use cases, if you see what I mean. So according to your definition, even if we all agree as a group on some use cases, I'm arguing that it's better to decouple them. Because yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the question of what form the decoupling takes, right? We were speaking about layers of interpretations versus separate databases. That's certainly something I want to get back into.
Yeah, and in that regard, I had a question for you indeed in chat. Yeah. I formulated as, because I thought it was intriguing that you do agree. I don't expect one tool to fit all use cases. You made that statement in two meetings ago when I rewatched it.
Yep.
So it's interesting. I don't see why you make the distinction that you don't see one tool to fit all use cases, but you do see one data format to fit all use cases. Because for me, tool and data format, they're almost equivalent. They're just at a different level of operation.
Yeah, no, and I don't see that at all.
So maybe you can clarify why is there the distinction for you?
I mean, of course, taken at its maximal value, it cannot make sense. But here's what I believe. We have a kind of a generic use case, which is representation of, I call them viewpoints / concept graphs / but representation of, yeah, let me say viewpoints. The fact that they can be expressed as a graph is almost accidental, though it isn't. But there's different ways to describe the world. And part of our common goal is to represent that, to manipulate that. And then you get into all the connected goals, such as scoring, evolution, curation, but we're acting on something which is a representation of knowledge. And the fact that, for example, mapping and deciding, that's a very good example. They're completely different use cases, and they have different UX requirements. Like my diff and merge requirement is not the same as the canonicality requirement is not the same as the, but we are dealing with the same stuff, which is how ideas are represented as data. And that layer is what I think could be common. Now, there will be elements of the data structure, such as scoring, like I'm working a lot on alternative truth values here, which I expect to vary, to be plugged in, right?
So,
to
can
vary
I
per
stop you
use
there?
case. Okay,
Because
sure.
I mean, this is very lengthy what I did expect you to say, but it doesn't answer the question, why do you see that not as a problem in the case of a data format, but you do see that as a problem in the case of, what is the problem? Why don't you see that one tool can fit all use cases? Because you are saying one tool can represent all types of data. So why can't one tool support all those types of data?
Because for me, tools give affordances to user according to what the user wants to do. And in different use cases, users want to do different things with that data. So they should have different affordances. And so I expect they'll use different tools. Of course, it's possible to have one mega tool for millions of use cases, but there'll be so many knobs to, oh, now I'm doing this, so let's optimize for that operation, and now and hide those affordances and show those affordances, because there's too many affordances for too many actions.
So how is it different from too many affordances in a data format? If you're trying to interpret your centralized event bus with all these different affordances, developer affordances, let's call them, you have an API with all these different knobs you can use. Isn't it a similar problem that arises from a development perspective, a data format perspective, an API perspective, than the users on the front end with the affordances of buttons and clicks and drop downs? I don't see the difference.
I do see the difference that you can only, okay, there's many differences. One is you can only show so many buttons before the visual senses are overwhelmed. It need not be the case for ideas, but mostly it's the question of of API points. Like if you have, in theory, 1,000 API points, who cares? That's not true. I think it is also important. And I do want to minimize API, but I'm making, you're asking a generic question, so I'm giving a ridiculous generic answer. Let me take it from another angle instead. We're dealing with, what I'm saying is, we have 1,000 affordances to manipulate a common object. The fact that the combinations of objects varies and the combinations of ways to manipulate the object vary doesn't mean that there isn't an underlying object. Now, that said,
you're talking about the common abstraction now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but so you're saying that the common abstraction is useful, but that's the same again with a UI. A UI, as I said many times before, an abstraction is only as useful as you can actually enact on it, be it through a user interface, be it through an API. So
Yeah.
how is that different from just having one tool, one UI that only operates on the common abstraction?
Oh, it's entirely possible to do that, but I don't believe it's useful. The same way that, let me take it from another angle. We all know all data is ultimately bytes, and we could all be coding in machine language and working on bytes. And we use higher level languages because it's more convenient to do so, because it enables us to work at a higher level. Mm-hmm. And for me, a UX that worked with the common abstraction is the equivalent of coding in assembly language. It's too low level. We'll want higher level abstractions at the UX level to have cognitively useful operations. But that doesn't mean that there doesn't exist a lower layer that is common to what a lot of things are doing, which is data structures and so on.
But so which layer do you want the developers to operate on? The higher level of abstraction when they're dealing with those, or the lower one?
Both. In the sense that the higher level enable us to make sure that our lower level is not too is powerful enough to handle all the upper layers. But on the other hand, I do want to have the common abstraction that's low level enough that it can be common to all the higher levels.
There seems to be a contradiction here. So I agree with the fact that you want to have a level of abstraction that's suitable to the use cases, which is my exact reason for separating them, because I imagine the APIs to support use cases of centralizing the best argument to be distinct from what I call the base layer, which is a more foundational, it becomes an implementation detail of a secondary layer, and you hide the complexity, the underlying complexity of mapping that to a base layer. But I do argue that there are separate use cases that the base layer supports that are distinct from the base from the use case I want to support in the second layer, which does have a separate abstraction. Which is why I'm arguing there should be two separate APIs.
No, and I, it's my opinion is a bit in the middle. So I don't want to argue exactly against you, but I do argue against you in the sense, on the one hand, I do agree that some things will be in, I keep introducing classes and subclasses because I expect
polymorphism. Then I always find it weird you call it a second layer because I mean, it's simple polymorphism, right? In OP at least. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, what I'm saying is introduce another layer through polymorphism is what I'm saying. Introduce use case specific stuff through polymorphism.
And strategy pattern in OP through polymorphism. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's not exactly is it strategy pattern? Not quite, because strategy is about the actions. Here we're speaking even about the data content. Yes. For example, the scoring. I expect the score, because there's different kinds of scores and different scoring strategy. We all agreed on that, to live in the fields of the subclasses, right? So may or may not be available at the upper layer, except there's something you get from the scoring, which is, should I hide this in a user view?
Wait.
And that's probably something that should live in an upper layer.
You want to
store, implementation.
You want to store the scoring mechanism as a field in a subclass?
Yes, and that means, yes, it will live on the wire and everybody will see it, except people will be free to ignore it. I don't want separate storage for different layers.
So you would store competing scoring mechanisms all on the same object, and you have scoring 1, scoring 2, scoring 3 as separate fields of some sort?
No. I would have, somebody will generate scoring 1 objects which will have the scoring 1 field, and someone else will generate the scoring 2 object, which will have the scoring 2 field. And yes, and what happens then?
How are they linked? Because
they are about the same core object, which fortunately has the same signature through the mechanisms of canonicality as defined, as CDL define, or as Tim defines them. We have claims have an identity.
So is scoring stored within the object or outside of it and linking to the other objects?
I'm not sure. I think that I expect systems who know only their own scoring to emit simple composite objects. But it's true that an object that would like to have the to unite and merge different systems will have to store either. Now the question is what happens when they store both? Well, ideally they will store both in a unified object, which will have the fields of many subclasses. And here we're breaking the classic object paradigm. It's more RDF paradigm where you have this field and that field and that field, but you can ask for a view as this object, which has only these fields defined by this object. And this is why I'm closer to RDF than pure OO, because an object can have multiple fields defined by multiple types.
And there's no conflicts because they're fully defined by some unique namespaces, or?
Yes.
I mean,
RDF allows that easily.
So yeah, I mean, you can totally do that, and then you can imagine that each individual. I mean, this is a silly argument, so maybe let's make it more realistic. I mean, you can do that, but you're just centralizing everything to, yeah, it just goes counter to decoupling with varies. I don't see the point of storing 20,000 different scoring mechanisms in one object that all need to be returned whenever you retrieve that object. It just feels silly because all you're interested in when you're
But that's on
creating it-
demand. Like if you're a system in the ecosystem, you'll don't think REST, think GraphQL. You're saying I want an object and I want it according to that shape. So you're saying which fields you want.
All right, now I'm going to give my take on this,
Go ahead.
since we've hit a pause. Yeah, I don't see a philosophical or abstract definition for our layers of abstraction. I think that's artificial. I think it's trying to impose some sort of artificial order on something that's not what we're trying to do, and is going to get bogged down in these kinds of discussions. What I see is a group of academics / software engineers who kind of want the same thing and have differing views on how it should be done. And what we've always wanted is a way to try out our different ideas, meaning different UIs and whatever, and somehow still share the data as we do it, because somebody's going to hit on something and it's going to take off, and maybe will become our reference implementation. But while we're working towards it, we help each other out by sharing the data we've collected in different experiments, right? And that's why I see it as a practical definition of what we have in common. Because I don't think we're really trying to build on top of each other, with the exception of maybe Marc-Antoine, who has much more advanced, audacious objectives. But you know, I think what we want is something where, for now, we can share a common structure and yet experiment with UI. In terms of the question about should scoring be in that shared thing, I don't think data should be there, although maybe the pluggable model can be there so each person can implement their versions. And then, you know, maybe when people want to start trying out each other's scoring mechanisms on their own site, they can start pulling from the other person the data they've been collecting for that scoring for now. And then we think about a more efficient way to do that. But, you know, I don't see it needing to be stored in the base level. The problem with the lowest common denominator in the base level, of course, is this thing where on round trips, you lose data, right? Because you have a silo that stores one kind of data, and then everybody's pulling from the central repository, which has the lowest common data set. And that's good enough. But I think, you know, ideally, I would want to see a process where somebody hits on something that seems to be working. We go, okay, yeah, maybe we all want to adopt that feature. And then we move it down into the base layer because it's added on to our common feature set, right? That's how I wanted to approach it, and is what makes sense to me in a practical approach.
How is that not building on top of something we share? Because you start out by saying that's not something we, well,
it is
definitely
something
I want to do, but
it is building off of something we share. Yes, it's the common data set, the common.
Exactly.
It could be a central database. It would be a mix of databases. Probably we'd have a central database, and then we keep our own data in a local store, right?
So what I'm trying to say is that common thing we all share, it's much more fundamental than some of the very detailed formalized argument structuring things we've been doing to support the most fundamental use cases. It's like from many different sources on the internet, you want to link to the same claim. Basically, all you need is a database that stores claims and then links all of them to external resources. For example, that's one use case that I wanted to support. I think all these types of resources of linking disparate resources together that all point to the same claim. That's a system worth in its own right. We already right now know to one degree or another we all want. Whether or not those claims are part of an argument of one specific structure doesn't matter at this point. I don't think we need to agree that, and we maybe might push it down to that system at some point if it is something that is shared. But
Well, I mean, we all know we want that shared part, but I disagree that any UI is at that level. I think all the UIs are peers, right?
what do you mean by peers? Because I mean, in terms of UI,
I mean,
you are
not
gonna
built
need
into
to-
the base level, not built into the base level, not. It's not like one site gets to store all its data and not worry about everybody else.
It's not one side.
Everybody else has to.
I mean, there is a use case that involves having a UI, and every site can create their own UI, but there would be a UI
Yes.
that shows a claim and shows all the resources that claim is
Sure.
used in, for example. And I don't care whether you host that or me, but it's a shared data backend that pulls in the data and represents that which supports a use case from the users.
Right.
Because
right.
it supports a use case for users, there is a UI. And no, we don't have to share that UI. But I mean, like that base layer has use cases with front-end facing user stuff. That's what I mean by that base layer has a UI. And it's not a debate map with an argument structure and all that. It's different.
Well,
May I?
we haven't gotten down to then what it is that I don't feel like we fully elucidated every single use case that
Exactly.
we're all wanting it to support.
But that's why I
don't
think tomorrow it should be a good exercise to focus again much more on use cases, because that's the one thing we're way too technical, whereas all of these things, like what an API should support, is fully determined by what the use cases are that you want to support and which ones you want to use together and which ones are optional to use, etc. That's what it fundamentally determines the system you're going to build and what we can agree on or cannot agree on. So my hope is to do that tomorrow.
Fair enough, but my experience when I come with use cases is, oh, that's too advanced, I don't care.
That's fine.
Well, but that may mean we don't have a data structure in common. I mean, basically, I make a lot of very advanced data structures because I try to advance advanced use cases. And if the use cases are
They're written in as a user facing,
Yeah.
not a developer. Like if it is as a user, I want to see an overview of the formalized structure for an argument so that blah, blah, blah. If you can write out that full use case with the so that and everything tied in, then it's useful to have. Then
Okay.
the question becomes, how are these connected? Are there more primary steps that need to be done in order to support that use case, etc.?
I mean, I
can
think
totally-
your set of use cases are much more, we could say, advanced, or outside of the scope of the purposes that I outlined in the white paper. And that's why in your case, I see that a lot of these use cases are not in common with the canonical debate as I've defined it and as I've seen.
Yeah, no, but I think actually they're necessary for accomplishing the main goal of the CDL, but you don't see them as necessary, but I think they are.
We have to discuss each of those use cases on
Individually.
that. Yeah, and on that
Well,
basis, I think
we
that is
don't-
an
That's
excellent
perfectly
exercise.
fine.
A
But
first
wait,
step
let
is
me
not
just-
even deciding on whether or not we need them. It's understanding them and having a common understanding of those use cases. And then we can see
Yeah.
which ones depend on one another. And that's how you start
Right.
grouping the ones that depend on one another. And that's how you can start decoupling systems.
But just to finish my thought, and also which goes with this, is I think there are a lot of use cases. Most of the like for the other systems envisioned, the use cases are like, yeah, it's the same goal, but I would do it differently, right? curation is one of those. But also scoring, you know, how would you show scoring? How would you show this? How would you show that? We each have a preferred way to do that. And what that ends up being is a similar feature set, but like kind of a fork in the road in terms of, are you going to do it that way or not? You know, are you going to do centralized curation, or are you going to crowdsource the curation? That sort of thing. So we all agree somehow we want there to be some sort of curation, at least, you know, the deduping and that sort of thing. You know, maybe hiding irrelevant things, however, but we each have an idea of trying it out a different way. And that,
so the trick there is agreeing on the abstraction and coming up with an abstraction, exposing that, and then making those use cases that can come from anywhere. They can be initiated from anywhere. And then it's the initiating system that decides how to actually implement it. But if we can agree on what needs to happen, and so that, then we can agree on that and stop there. And that's why you start decoupling the different components.
While we're in an experimental phase, and then at some point, I do think there's going to be a phase where we will have to close off some of those. What I'm foreseeing is the question of, should the community do the curation, or should it be an internal or privileged group? And that one, like, I think we should experiment with it. But at some point, if we, for example, decide having, for example, a centralized group is creating too much distrust, the only solution then is to close it off for everybody. You can't have one site that has a centralized group that gets to control everything, and then another site that crowdsources it, because it undermines the whole goal of crowdsourcing. But that's just an example. I don't want to dive into that, but I'm just saying. Yeah.
That's an interesting example. I would like to riff on it a bit, because of course my reflex is, why not both? Because I understand what you're saying about the CDL. My thinking is the CDL is one tool in an ecosystem of collective intelligence tools, and it may be an important one, and it may be, but I'm trying to think, what are collective intelligence tools and what do they need to share to become useful to one another? And that way, both being on the table makes perfect sense to me. Now, would both being on the table, even for the CDL, make sense? I'm not sure here. But I suspect that there will be, irresolvable disagreements, even about the terms of the questions within the CDL, and that this will require some way of, on the one hand, accepting a certain diversity in a way for people who don't feel represented to express their views, but also a way to avoid sabotage, because there will be sabotage, and close the door to sabotage and only allow a certain form of constructive disruption. I don't have an answer there.
Yeah, the examples I'm bringing up exactly relate to is permitting that approach, creating an attack vector. And if we need to cut off that attack vector, unfortunately, we have to close that essentially backdoor. Right?
But it is true that way, one difference we have in goals is for you're trying to create the CDL. I'm saying, yes, let's create the CDL, but as part of an ecosystem of tools. And this is one difference we have.
Well, and the canonical debate, again, is meant to be in an ecosystem. It just needs to be unassailable, right? It needs to be, in my opinion, like blockchain.
It's a valid use case.
Right?
It's a requirement, and it's a valid requirement, and I respect it.
So one way to approach this might be, again, or trying to get confirmation or buy-in on the principles, again, in the white paper. Do we all agree on these points? Knowing that some points will have trade-offs, right? Some points will have trade-offs, and that may have to come down in we're talking details, but
But to which my answer will often be, I agree that this is important to the CDL. Maybe it's not important to the grander ecosystem.
to the ecosystem. Yeah. No, no, and that's exactly, I agree with that. Yes.
To me, a lot of these issues are also, they can be decoupled from more like the what are we building is like, how are you gonna, I call them more issues of deployment, like how do you deploy it and whether or not you deploy. I think that the agreement we're going to have is not going to be like this system hosted on that server with that curation mechanism. It's going to be much more fundamental. It's going to be more something that each of us individually can deploy. And
Yes.
in a best case scenario, maybe we can share like a common database. But the first step, even before we can consider doing that, is first agreeing on what is it that we want to put in the database. And we can still deploy it differently. One can use GraphQL, I can use my simple relational database. That shouldn't be the issue. It's only the API and the data layer, basically, the use cases that we need to agree on.
I agree that we need to be able to have independent deployment. I'm not even sure we'll have a common database, though I understand that's a goal for the CDL. So we'll discuss that. But at the ecosystem level, what I expect is a common data format so we can exchange. So
Exactly.
We know what the API is returning and what kinds of questions we can ask the API. That's what I'm trying to define.
Exactly. And the secondary
yes,
goal is centralizing that and indeed having an unassailable system. And I don't disagree with the principles. I disagree that that should be a priority because it's much harder to agree on all these things, which are second step concerns if we don't even agree on an API.
Yeah. But the other question, and I think it's important, is given the CDL goal, which again, I want, for me is also a goal. And my goal is in a way very different, but in a way should enable it, is that if we accept that we have a polycentric system, like multiple systems, and yet some systems try to keep reference, and we want non-splintering is also a goal, right? So that means there has to be a way to ask the federated system, okay, what is this system's view on this topic? Sorry, I'll use the term topic, whether it's a claim, an entity, an argument, shouldn't matter. But how does this system view this topic? And what does this system have to contribute to this topic? And in one of those systems will be the CDL. And that should always be, one API call away. But this kind of shared awareness that we may not have named the topic the same.
Well, and the abstraction of topic hasn't even been defined. That's the problem. We're trying to define what is a topic. That is the API, essentially. What is the extra data that other systems might append to it?
Exactly. And this is why I started with topic mapping. And this is why I still think it's the core. What's a topic? How are two descriptions of an entity the same?
But that's very weird because what's central to argument mapping is not entities, it's claims.
Yeah, but I think what makes claims the same is the entities.
Yeah.
Including the predicates.
But that's progressive formalization, right? So we know that there's claims without entities modeled and mapped. So
we can do everything at the claim level because I'm more and more, how should I put it? I'm doing the pointless topology thing of saying, a linguistic statement or a formalized statement. They're all statements. A statement, a symbol, I should say, is referring to a bunch of concepts or to a cloud of concepts, because sometimes it's, it's some of them and neither of them. And with some things undefined and some things defined and some things not agreed upon. It shouldn't matter. And the concepts themselves are not to be modeled except as this lattice of saying, well, this is a more precise expression of that. This linguistic statement or formal statement is a more precise expression of that other linguistic statement. So you have more and more progressive statements that are supposed to corral in on the concepts that are being referred to tighter and tighter, but you'll never reach them. It's not, there's no points in that topological space. And if we're looking at, again, formal or informal, that's not the point, or formal according to system X or system Y, that's not the point. But we have statements referring to concepts. The concepts don't exist in the system, they only exist in the brain. What we're doing is an algebra of statements. And the fact that in some cases, and that's something I owe to you, I'll be interested in the component statements, so component substatements. Instead of saying more precise, well, I'll define the precision in terms of saying, well, the sun rises in the east has as components the sun, the notion of rising, and the notion of east, without saying how they're assembled, because that's the formal layer. But I can refer to these linguistic or even formalized entities, sun, rise, and east, as components of this sentence, without, even if we haven't agreed on the formalization layer. That's progress, and that's something I owe to you, Stephen, because it makes it possible to relate claims across using entities without agreeing on a formal layer. That's good, because you're right, agreeing on a formal layer is hard. But the notion is that we can still speak about the relation between statements, whether they're claims or entities, in a unified way. We don't have to know that this is a claim or this is an entity. And we can use the containment relation as another relation to help us see the relationship between entities that we have not yet related because they share entities. I don't know if what I've said has been clear or understood.
Well, I don't think it gets as clear to many of these things you've talked about before.
Yes. No, but do you see how it enables agreeing on a common model without having to agree on a formal layer, but still introducing the formal layer without having to agree on it, which I think is great.
Well, you agree on the reference, you agree to the things you're pointing to that you want to formalize. And that's indeed what the base layer should do. And the most central one of that is a claim. And that's why I'm saying, from a very agile perspective, why don't we just start with a database in which we store claims, and that we have some mechanism that different systems can attach different formalizations to, and we come up with the use cases. Why is it that, like, what are the use cases that will tie these different systems together? Like, suppose you're on the CDL. CDL is one system, one formalization. What is it now that you want to do across systems?
How can you, okay. I made it, what I tried to say, and obviously it didn't reach because you're still saying the center is claim. I don't think it's clear that the center is claim. The center is linguistic expression of something, which may be a claim, an argument, or an entity. It doesn't matter. And in a way, the boundary between some of these is sometimes very obscure.
Yeah, fair enough. You can also link to entities. But yeah, we need to approach this from a use case perspective, because this doesn't get us anywhere. The question is, why do you want to link to entities? What do you want to retrieve from other systems, and what is the common abstraction of the entity? What do you hope to, what is the user interface you would show if you, from a base layer, show the entity? What do you see? And then you might say, well, there is no user interface. And then you're talking purely from a technological point of view, like how do you store all of it in the same database? And I'm not interested in that discussion right now. I'm interested in what is it that we can all share that might be able to link different formalisms together.
And we are dealing with a certain set of relations between topics. Some of them are about.
And are there any types of relations we can all agree on?
I think so. That's yeah, I think that's absolutely doable.
So my reason for putting claims central is because I believe that the ones that we do already agree on and that we're most likely to agree on is a very ambiguous form of support and oppose. It's that thing that's a primary thing that I'm missing when I'm browsing the internet, that you can't easily attack anything that's written anywhere in a centralized fashion. That's my primary use case that I want to support. And that's why my base layer is much more narrow than the best representation of an argument to come to that conclusion of that claim, which is also relevant and interesting, but it does a lot more than just having 10 different blogs that all make the same claim, have a centralized place where everyone reading those 10 different blogs from different viewpoints, from different political parties, can all centralize their comments, if you will, in a more structured fashion. That's my main use case, and that's all my use cases.
It's a great use case, and one I support.
Those are the base layer for me.
No, I support and oppose. Yes.
Yeah, I would say that part of that, and I don't see it working except being in the base layer, is a definition and functionality or features that define what makes a claim canonical, right? What is the unique thing that defines a claim? And again, like you, I don't want to talk about database storage. I don't think it's a sequential ID that makes a claim unique. Obviously, we want to dedupe, and how do you dedupe? And I don't think it's enough to say, well, each system can do it its way, because if the base layer is supposed to be doing deduplication, we need to all be on the same page as far as how that works.
Agreed. I've always said deduplication is a base layer concern, but what are the user stories tied to deduplication? And I much rather want to focus on deduplication of claims than on how to represent the syllogism for that reason.
The question is, deduplication very much hangs on formalization, I think. And this is where the question, if we don't want to impose a single formalization, and I think I've agreed, and I agree we don't, then how can we deduplicate across formalism? And that becomes an important question.
It's progressive
formalization. But it's more than progressive formalization. It's about accepting that even a deduplicated claim, and now let's speak about claims and arguments, but it's also true of entities, by the way. A deduplicated topic can have multiple expression, if only in different formalizations, and we still want to be able to deduplicate it. So any claim has multiple identifiers, even though any one system will choose one as canonical, because they'll choose one formalism as their canonical formalism, which is fine.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
they need to be able to recognize that, hey, this claim came to me from that system. It has this identifier because they're using this different formalism. And so I need to translate that to, and retain, oh, look, this identifier in that other system looks like corresponds to this identifier in my system, because they're not deduplicating the way I am. Getting people to agree on deduplication, I think, is an anti-goal. Getting people to identify statements across multiple canonicalizations is the goal for me.
I think, first of all, in practice, that might be impossible, because again, it implies that you understand all different formalizations. Otherwise, you cannot do that, or at least the ones you're interested in. And I think the main reason for...
No, you just need piecewise, you just need the graph of translations to be connected.
Yeah, okay, so you need to understand. Okay.
No, it's a much lower requirement. If you have n formalisms, you need the graph to be connected. How many edges does that need around n? Whereas understanding all is an n squared.
Can you give a concrete example? The earliest round is in, let's say, the base layer. You have different formalizations of that. You want different formalizations of different layer 2 systems to point to each other and say, this the earth round is the same than the earth round in the other system? Is that how I understand it? Or like, what's the problem with just having these two different formalizations point to the earth round in the base layer and let that be the common? I don't see I really don't see the problem.
Because the base layer identity, this is a centralized view. It requires people to agree on not only just a base layer, but on a single database.
Yes. Well, if you deploy it like that, yes, but that is the goal. You want to have a shared database. If you don't share the database or the event bus or whatever, how you want to implement it, yeah, you're not going to be able to link things to one another. You need some type of unique ID, or I'm saying that unique ID should just be an ID from the base layer that different formalizations link to.
And what I'm saying is, for me, this is a point of centralization, and I'm trying to avoid it. What I'm trying to do is so that if I have an unknown ID, I can ask the distributed hash table, what are other IDs that this links to, until I get one that is an ID I know and understand.
Now you have a decentralized, I mean, only if these other layer twos point to other layer twos, they become connected. Whereas
Yes,
the whole point.
I said it has to be a connected graph, yes.
Yeah, but how are they going to get connected? Like if we have 4 different systems already within this group, that means that each of these systems need to start pointing to duplicates in other systems in order to have a connected graph. The whole point is if we can all point to one in the base layer, you only need to make one connection, and that's how you centralize.
What you can do is 1 is connected to 2, 2 is connected to 3, 3 is connected to 4. And if 1 gets something from 4, it can ask the other ones, please translate this for me and relate this for me. And the chain allows me to do the connection.
Okay,
Until
I think I understand
down.
What's the problem with centralizing?
The problem with centralizing is people.
I mean, for me, that's a use case, literally. So what I say is a feature that needs to be supported. You're saying is a problem. So this is weird.
Okay. It's because things don't start with a single system in real life. People already have done concept mappings using whatever they have. The fact that they have identifiers which are not ours is already a fact. Saying we won't talk to them unless they standardize on our nascent standard, not gonna happen. We want to be able to talk to people who already have data that they've already standardized according to their own schemes. So scheme translation.
That only works if they share the same abstraction that we're trying to point to. Otherwise, you're just pointing to something random, right? So only if there's some
or if the abstraction is sufficiently translatable.
Yeah, I disagree that I want that. I'm okay starting from scratch, given the proper design, because I think crowdsourcing and tools to pull data in and translate and that sort of thing into a central place will be sufficient. And I don't think we're losing more data on the new discussions than, yeah.
I gave the example of old stuff, but I also think that the reality is multiple conversations and personal knowledge bases are being created all the time, and being able to interpret with them, for me, is a goal. For me, that's a use case. And expecting them to change everything they've done to talk to us, I don't expect to happen.
But there are no big databases of argument maps, to be frank. Kiala is maybe the biggest one that I know of right now. And even then, if you centralize, there's no problem in having some type of adapter that links the current formalizations and ties them to, I mean, it's still possible even. So it even doesn't rule that option out. So I really don't see the problem.
There's Psych. Psych is a big claim database.
What's the name?
Psych. I gave the pointer to the Doug Lennett video.
How do you write that?
CYC.
COIC?
No, CYC.
CYC.
And just look for Doug Linnett. It's not open, but it exists. The problem is most of them are silos.
Yeah, and I think convincing them to open their silos is about is going to be as hard as at least as just getting people to put in the data again. I think people are motivated if they see something is going to solve the problem, right? It's going to be permanent and solve the problem.
Yeah, I think Wikipedia is a good reference. I mean, if what we're trying to build is a Wikipedia of arguments, doesn't Wikipedia prove that it works in a centralized fashion?
There's Debatepedia. I don't know if you've used it much. Right now, I think one of the most interesting ones is what's it called? The Prove Me Wrong thing. Really interesting. But Debatepedia has tons of stuff.
Right.
That doesn't answer the question, though. I mean, what's the problem with a Wikipedia-ish thing, but for a centralized base claim database that links to all the different formalizations out there? Why is that not a possible, plausible goal?
That's absolutely fine. But even Wikipedia, you'll notice, if you look at Wikidata, right, it uses the DBpedia identifiers, which are basically the Wikipedia identities, page identities, right? And then it does same as and maps to something else and maps to something else and maps to Freebase and maps to, because there's always a multiplicity of maps. Map diversity is a fact of life. There's never going to be one map to roll them all. Even when you have one like Wikipedia, that's, yes,
it all points to a Wikipedia article.
And even that one, people at some point want to be more detailed about something, and people need to think the abstractions differently. Especially
right, but the question here is Wikipedia trying to incorporate and map Twitter, and is it trying to incorporate and map Facebook, and is it trying to incorporate and map Medium? It isn't. We want to be the Wikipedia
exactly
of arguments.
But what I'm saying is even Wikipedia, for all its success, when people try to map concepts at the Wikipedia level, they have to map to other stuff because some people start using other things because
that's
something
progressive formalization.
Wikipedia.
That's progressive formalization.
No, that's intermapping, because intermapping is always a fact of life. Because centralization always is, it's always one force, and there's a centrifugal force and a centripetal force, always. They're always in conflict with people who want to go their own way and do their own thing.
Right, but I don't want the canonical debate to be an intermapping hub. It's not the ESB of information, right? It is, what is it? What does ESB stand for? Something service bus. Okay. You know, it's the data exchange hub, right? Architecture, but
yeah, and I'm very much trying to do an ESB. Yeah. That's a fact.
Yeah, right. But you can do an ESB and use the canonical debate as
absolutely. That's the goal.
You're intermapping.
And I understand. Right. And I understand the canonical debate wants to centralize and have its own unique IDs. That's perfectly fine for it to centralize and have its own unique IDs. But I'm just saying it will at some point, if it wants to gain from data from other sources, it will gain data from other sources that have not used it, that have used their own identifiers.
No, right. But you know, one of the fundamental points of the canonical debate is debates right now suffer from a problem of massive repetition and data loss, right? People are already doing the work of repeating the data over and over and over again. And so we just wanted to have a place for people to accumulate it, right? Yeah.
No, and I'm totally in favor of doing that. And yes, of doing, CDL can work like a centralized thing and have unique identifiers. I'm just saying, I don't expect those unique identifiers to become, I expect them to be referred to by anybody, but I don't expect them to be adopted. That's a totally different thing. And that's why we still need the ESB bus between
Right.
CDL
Okay.
and other stuff.
Right. That's fine.
Yeah.
But that's actually a different point though from what I was talking about, making things canonical and disambiguated, is essentially, I think that the base layer, the definition of the claim needs to include a primary key and not
I
a
agree with that.
primary generated abstract or, generated key, but a key based on
The content. A content
its
addressable
inherent
key.
nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that means choosing a formalization.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
But yeah, the common formalization is just the statement text, which
I
is why I
disagree
still
with
think the
that
statement text is the
because
identity.
you can
of the
say the
claim.
same sentence twice and mean two different things, and therefore it's not a primary key. The
Yeah, but
text
that's
itself is not a primary.
you're talking about two different entities here. You're talking about a decontextualized claim, and you're talking about a contextualized claim. One is a claim which is only a statement. The other one, when you say something different, the decontextualized one, which can mean two things, is an entity we want to map and link to. We want to be able to link to things and show that they might mean different things in different contexts. The
That's an important
No.
conversation.
No.
That's an important
I want to
conversation. I have
link
tons to say about that. But
Yeah.
I have to leave at the hour.
Hmm.
Sorry. But yes.
I mean, I would just say I want to link to one of those decontextualized.
That's
and
also
have it
possible.
mean a very specific thing.
But that,
I don't want
when
it to
you
be
attach the
all
context as
those
part of the
possible
end-
interpretations of that
No,
phrase.
but
I want
both
it to
are
be
valid.
exactly that.
Both are valid
Yeah.
because you don't always
And-
know the context if it's not formalized. And sometimes you want to centralize on what are all the different, but either way, yes, then the thing it means, the context becomes part of that identity, and then you solve the problem because then it is a different entity. But let's approach this because it's very technical again. I hope tomorrow from a use case perspective. So let's try to write these down as SA from an interaction perspective. Let's give it a try. We haven't done this in like a year.
Okay, but I do think this conversation is really important about formalized versus informalized canonicality.
But yeah, let's just have the discussion in terms of use cases. Why is this important in terms of use
No,
cases?
I think this one is not exactly use case-ish, but anyway.
It is. Why do you want to link to a decontextualized one or a contextualized one? Those are separate use cases. That means that they might need to be supported as separate entities. We can totally have that discussion. If not, then something's wrong.
Okay. I think this is pro-Christian, but okay, sure, of course it's possible. Won't be. It's not the best way to have that conversation is what I'm saying, but fair enough. It's possible.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.